Noah Solom, I'm the president of Indigo, and we just want to welcome everybody to this very interesting brown bag talk. This is Dr. Alistair Young. He has been, this is his third year, correct, on the faculty at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. He specializes in really focusing on research and writing about transatlantic trade and partnerships, and obviously the new transatlantic trade and investment partnership that's currently being discussed is a huge part of that, and that's really what a lot of his focus is on right now. He's written on a lot of different aspects of that. I've especially read one of his articles on the agricultural issues and concerns of that, and it's very interesting, very pleased to have him here and have him talking about the world's most valuable free trade area. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Young.
Okay. Well, thank you, Noah and Indigo, for inviting me, and thank you to Joe for providing the food. If it's not a rent-a-crowd, it's a feed-a-crowd. I'm talking about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership for three reasons. One is that it's a novel experiment creating the world's largest free trade area that has significant potential in terms of promoting economic growth and jobs in the United States and in the European Union. It also has an explicit ambition to set rules for the rest of the world, and analytically, it's interesting because it is the first manifestation of a new pattern of trade politics. And those are all things that I'm going to talk about in this talk. Thought it might be useful to say a little bit about why I study transatlantic relations. One might say it has origins at birth. I was born in New Jersey, but both of my parents are British, so I've always been looking across the Atlantic. But I came to sort of political maturity during the reheating of the Cold War in the early 1980s. And I started out as a Cold Warrior. And when I did do my master's degree, I wanted to study the Soviet Union. Well, my Russian was not good enough to get into the Harriman Institute at Columbia. And so I diverted into international political economy. And thank goodness, 7 months after I graduated, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. So that was handy. Quite why I chose IP, I cannot remember. But what particularly interests me about IP is how international trade and international cooperation affects the capacity of states to regulate consumer protection and the environment. And after I finished my master's degree, I was lucky enough to get a job, essentially a pre-doc at the University of Sussex, studying the EU Single European Market Program, which is the most intensive and extensive effort to remove regulatory barriers to trade among states. While I was doing my I liked it there. They offered to fund me, so I did my PhD. And while doing my PhD, I got involved as a research assistant on a project for the European Commission on the external impact of the single market. I then had a postdoc, a proper one this time, at the European University Institute, which is in a Renaissance monastery in the hills above Florence. I highly recommend it as a destination. And I was in a transatlantic program, and I had to come up with a new project. And at that time, the dispute between the United States and the European Union over agricultural biotechnology was becoming an issue. So I studied that. And that was then parlayed after I got my job at the University of Glasgow. I got involved in a study for the British Treasury and the Dutch Ministry of Finance on transatlantic regulatory barriers. And then in 2005, in a study for the European Commission again, on how 10 years of transatlantic cooperation, including regulatory cooperation, had gone as part of the new transatlantic agenda. So I've been interested in these issues for a long time, and it underlines that attempts at regulatory cooperation between the United States and the European Union have also been going on for a long time. This time, it's different. Right? The negotiations for a comprehensive agreement were launched in July. The ambition is to complete them quickly on one tank of gas, in the words of US Trade Representative Michael Froman, ideally by the end of 2014. As a cautionary note, the European Union and Canada earlier this month announced that they had reached a political agreement on a less ambitious trade negotiation. That took them 4 years to get to the political agreement, and there are technical issues to be ironed out before they finalize the legal texts. 2014 is the target. There's been one round of negotiations thus far. There was supposed to have been a second one, but that fell foul to the government shutdown. And they're struggling to reschedule because the same folk at the USTR are negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the same folk in the European Union are negotiating with Japan. So they're kind of busy. So what's at stake in this issue? We're looking at an agreement that tries to build a bridge between the world's two largest economies. In nominal prices, half of world GDP. Purchasing power parity is about 40% of world GDP. And the European Union is extremely important for the United States. It is the most important destination for exports of goods after Canada, important source of imports of goods after China. In terms of service exports and imports, foreign direct investment flows inward and outward, and foreign business activity. The European Union is by far and away the United States' most important economic partner. Now, this inward and outward FDI stock will become really important later in the story, so I'll flag that now. But as a result, former USTR Ron Kirk described the United States and the European Union as sharing the largest and most complex economic relationship in the world. So what are they trying to do? They want to eliminate all tariffs on goods between the United States and the European Union. They want to try and mitigate regulatory differences on goods and services. So the product characteristics of a good have to be met if you're going to sell it into a particular market. So differences in regulations prevent goods from being sold in other markets. In services, it's quite frequent to have restrictions on nationality of ownership, or there are regulatory provisions which, while not intentionally discriminatory, make it harder for foreign firms to operate. And there are all sorts of differences in terms of inspection regimes and certification to make sure that standards are being met. There's also an ambition to increase access to government procurement and to further liberalize investment. So what might come of this? The European Commission has asked the Centre for Economic Policy Research in London to do a general equilibrium model to predict the possible outcome of the agreement. This is by far the most widely cited study. In fact, basically, it's the only study that's been publicly available on the potential impacts of the agreement. It all needs to be taken with a grain of salt, as a good economist will tell you. Nonetheless, as a good economist will also tell you, as soon as you put a number on something, that becomes fact. Right? So everybody, right, there are all sorts of caveats and so on in the report about what may or may not happen, but everyone just talks about this. Right? Just so you're aware. So they consider two possible scenarios. The more ambitious one is what everyone talks about, which sees a total elimination of tariffs, a 25% reduction in non-tariff barriers to trade, and a 50% reduction in public procurement costs. The predicted impact on the US economy of $125 billion, or about 0.4% of increase in US GDP. All of that is expected to come for increases in exports. The expectation is that US exports to the European Union would increase by 36%. This agreement is also expected to be beneficial for the rest of the world. The prediction is that the rest of the world will gain about $133 billion a year as a result of full implementation. It's important to recognize, however, that all of those benefits come from regulatory cooperation. Right? By the US and the European Union having fewer differences amongst themselves, it makes it easier for the rest of the world to trade with them. And the expectation is that they will agree common standards, which will then become global standards, which will facilitate trade amongst other countries as well. The tariff reductions is trade diverting, so bad for the rest of the world, and things like government procurement, liberalization don't do much for them. This CPR went so far as to highlight the sectors most likely to be affected. The important thing to take away from this is the impacts are expected to be much greater in goods than in services, and by far and away the most important sector affected is motor vehicles, with expectations of US exports to the EU in cars increasing between 200 and 350%. The British Embassy, along with the Bertelsmann Foundation and the Atlantic Council, have done a state-by-state projection of what the impacts are likely to be. What they've done is taken the CPR study, the impact by sector, and then looked at what the economic composition of different states is and done a plug and chug. Okay, so we're getting further and further away from reality, but this is what's out there. So the expectation is exports from Georgia to Europe would increase by over 30%. Motor vehicle exports are expected to increase by $2 billion, and exports in wood and paper, chemicals, and other transport equipment by about $550 million a year. Employment is also expected to increase. Overwhelmingly, the increase is going to be in business services. These are not directly affected by the agreement. The idea is these are the services that support the increased trade that would come from the agreement.
Alistair?
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but how does this work with a finished product like motor vehicles? I can see if they're sending parts back and forth and that lowers the cost and or increases productivity, and there's an economic gain. But if the U.S. is exporting more cars to Europe, and Europe is exporting more cars to the U.S., but the fixed numbers of cars bought remains the same, how do they both benefit substantially?
Well, the costs of cars go down, so demand goes up.
The demand goes up?
Yeah, because costs go down, so demand goes up.
Okay.
Then there's a question about why now? Part of this is the result of two underlying trends. There's the increasing interpenetration of the two economies. From the mid-1980s, you had privatization within the European Union, deregulation in the United States, opening up scope for more foreign direct investment. That has been building and accumulating since then. There's also the issue of increasing concern about competition from the rest, and by that rest they really mean China. And so here there's a sense that Western Europe and the United States need to do something new and different in order to be able to respond to this competitive challenge. And China's impact on international trade has grown dramatically since it joined the WTO in 2001, with its share of global trade rising from about 4% to about 12% in 10 years. Right? So there's a new change there. And then there's sort of more proximate causes. One is that both the United States and the European Union are facing jobless recoveries, and this deal is sold very much in terms of a stimulus package. It's a cheap way to boost economic growth. The other issue is that we've had the death of the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations. The agreement reached its sort of apogee in the middle of 2008. Not much has happened since. And even WTO Secretary General Pascal Lamy in December 2011 described the round at an impasse. There is still a ministerial meeting in Bali in December, but the agenda is now so constrained there is basically nothing on it of any significance for either the United States or the European Union. They're both looking elsewhere to secure increased market access. So what are the distinctive features of this agreement? One is we're seeing the emergence of what might be called 21st century trade politics. You have really significant interpenetration between the United States and the European Union, and this changes the way trade is understood. Traditionally, we think of trade as being about tariffs, and with import competing firms seeking protection and export competing firms advocating domestic liberalization in order to secure market access abroad. That's not what's happening here. You have a situation in which the economies are so interpenetrated that 61% of US imports from the European Union occur within firms. 31% of US exports to the European Union occur within firms. They're not competing against each other, they're selling to themselves. Right? And this changes how they mobilize. And so what you're seeing in this case is the creation of transatlantic alliances in favor of liberalization. The automobile sectors in Europe and the United States made a joint submission in favor of liberalization. Same in chemicals, pharmaceuticals, financial services, express services, and at the peak association level too. So there's joint submissions by the Business Roundtable and the European Roundtable, and also by the US Chamber of Commerce and its equivalent in Europe, Business Europe. So this is a new thing. We haven't seen this before. Business groups on both sides of the Atlantic, both wanting the same thing. In addition, because the economies are so interpenetrated and are so already quite developed, there's relatively little expected impact on labor markets. Very few people are expected to have to change jobs between sectors where their skill set might not fit. The estimation is that only 5 in 1,000 people would have to change jobs over a 5-year period. So pretty much close to normal, change jobs across sectors. So pretty minimal. And as a result, the AFL-CIO is not hostile to this agreement. They think it could be beneficial for American workers if the rules are right. But that's a very different position from that they've taken on the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which they're much more hostile about. The other thing is the prominence of regulatory barriers to trade in the agreement. Because low tariffs between the United States and the European Union are quite low, there's not that much gain to be had from liberalizing. Because of the size of the trade flows, it'll make a significant difference in terms of competitiveness, but the real gains from trade will come from dealing with regulatory barriers to trade. These present new challenges. With tariffs, you can simply lower them. Their only purpose is to restrict trade, so if you want to liberalize, you can just lower them. But regulatory barriers are there because they're actually serving some other public policy objective, and the trade effects are a side effect of that objective. Assuming you still want to pursue that objective, you're not willing to just do away with the regulations, so you need to find some way to manage those differences. I'll come back to that in a moment. But because you're doing that, you have to involve a lot of non-traditional trade policy players. Legislatures become more important, regulators become more important, and consumer and environmental groups become more important in the process. The other difference is that there is very much this one eye on the rest. And there's a very explicit intention to rig the rules to favor the United States and the European Union. The EU's Trade Commissioner Karel de Gucht said they want to work together on developing global rules and standards which will shape the future business environment of the world for years to come. And this is about setting specific product standards that everyone will follow, but it's also about establishing common understandings of disciplines on government procurement and foreign direct investment, which will then become the focal point for any future multilateral negotiations. They'll be default condition. So rather than just being about freeing trade between each other, it's also about trying to set the rules for the rest of the world. Now, as I mentioned, mitigating regulatory differences is the big issue. This is where the big benefits are, but it's also the toughest nut to crack. Within the European Union, there was a process of approximation, trying to replace different national rules with a single common rule. But that is really difficult to do because it tends not to be a compromise. It tends to be one side gets its way and the other doesn't. Right? So you have both sides would gain from liberalization, but one side would incur the adjustment cost of changing its practices to fit the other's rules. Right? As a result, there are distributional implications, and approximation is difficult. Right? There's also opposition that this may be seen as a way of deregulating by adopting the lower standard. Now, because of these distributional implications, none of the transatlantic association, the transatlantic alliances, are advocating much in the way of approximation. Right? They're advocating equivalence, which I'll come back to. Less interpenetrated industries, particularly in agriculture, are advocating approximation, and as expected, they're advocating approximation based on what they do. So there's a coalition of 64 agricultural interest groups in the United States, from beekeepers to almond growers, and including the American Farm Bureau and the Grocery Manufacturers Association, that have demanded that the European Union adopt a US style of regulation on food safety, adopting sound science and not the precautionary principle. Right? So they want the Europeans to adjust to them. As you might expect, non-governmental organizations are not thrilled about this. There's a transatlantic coalition of non-governmental organizations that have insisted that national regulatory autonomy be preserved, including the right to maintain the precautionary principle. Negotiators on both sides have said that it's important that both sides retain the right to establish what level of protection they consider appropriate, which basically means they accept that the precautionary principle will stay. And so that's going to be an issue there. Right? So that's one side, the US wanting the EU to change. European farmers want the Americans to adopt European-style geographic indications, right? So that something like Parma ham can only come from Parma in Italy. The United States considers designations such as feta cheese to be a generic term, not to the Europeans, and so the Europeans want them to change. The Europeans would like to get at least what they got out of the Canadians, which is the Canadians will now sell feta-style cheese. But the US agricultural interests have said no way, and in fact they want to push back on geographic indication protection in the EU. So here we have quite strong clashes. Equivalence tends to be less politically charged because you get the benefits of liberalization without either side having to incur the cost of adjustment. You accept that each side's standards are the same or equivalent in effect, and you can just recognize them as being the same. Now, again, NGOs tend to be quite skeptical about this. This looks like lowest common denominator decision making. Whatever's the easiest standard will be the one that people will meet. So there's still some opposition, but it's not, you don't have clashes within the industry groups. So all the transatlantic alliances are in favor of this kind of agreement. But there are challenges. One is the question about whether the regulatory objectives are actually the same. The chemical industries on the US and European Union don't think that the objectives of the chemical regulations of the two parties are sufficiently similar that there can be equivalence any time in the near future. It's an aspiration. Right. Then there's a question, even if you agree that they're equivalent in effect, are the domestic rules actually the same in delivering them? The automobile industry and the European Commission say this is the case with automobile safety. It is safe. Both cars both produce both sides, perfectly safe. We should be able to have mutual recognition. The Highway Safety Transportation Administration is not persuaded, and it wants it to be demonstrated to it on a case-by-case basis that they are actually equivalent in effect. The automobile industry would much prefer the assumption that they're equivalent in effect, and then the regulators object on specific grounds. And then there's a question of, even if you get through all that, can you accept equivalence? Right? The Food and Drug Administration's requirements about how it sets rules does not allow it to simply accept equivalence. Right? It would have to go through a regulatory rulemaking process in the United States. Now, they're also looking at ways to reduce the costs of compliance. And there are things you can do here which, by making the regulatory process speedier and more transparent. The European Commission has indicated that it might move files on new GM varieties through the regulatory process between the key decision-making phases more quickly. The pharmaceutical industry would really like the FDA and the European Medicines Association to accept each other's certification of their good manufacturing practices, so they don't have to get to sell to Europe. From America, you have to be checked by the FDA and by the European Medicines Evaluation Agency. It would be nice if you only had to be checked by one. So those kinds of things. And there's an attempt to avoid future barriers. This is both by making each other aware of what's coming down the pipe, trying to avoid rules that have unnecessarily adverse trade effects. I'm a bit skeptical about how well this would work. Early warning systems and trade impact assessments have been part of transatlantic cooperation since the mid-90s. Both policies are sufficiently complex that it's quite hard, sufficiently difficult to reach decisions internally, let alone without worrying too much about impacts on outsiders. But they're going to try that again. And there's the idea to create a living agreement. So be able to adopt new rules as you go forward. And here you don't have some of the problems of approximation because no one's got the rules in place already. There aren't the sunk costs. And you can agree a new rule in a new area of technology, and then that's actually beneficial. And the example they cite here is they've had progress establishing common standards for electric vehicles. Right? So this is possible, but then those standards then have to be translated into domestic rules. There are a number of other complications. The Europeans are really keen to discipline US state and local governments. There are regulatory differences in the United States, things to do with differences in wines and whether you can sell chocolate with alcohol in them and things like that, and bigger issues that bother them. There's also a sense that there's a lack of transparency. It's hard to know what standards you have to deal with where, so they'd like to have more transparency on that. But the big issue is government procurement. The Europeans hate Buy American clauses. Under the government procurement agreement that was negotiated in the margins of the World Trade Organization, European companies are treated as American for most federal contracts and by some states for some contracts. The Europeans want that extended to include all federal government contracts, federal government monies dispersed by states, and by all states. Georgia is in the crosshairs because Georgia is not one of the states that has joined the government procurement agreement. This is an issue that upsets the AFL-CIO. This is the bit they really don't like. But it's also seen as a key issue for the Europeans. Business Europe has gone so far as to say that if this isn't part of the deal, then they may not support it. Right? There's also the issue that has become particularly hot now on privacy and data transfers. The existing European privacy regulations prevent the transfer of data to firms in jurisdictions that do not provide adequate data protection as defined by the Europeans. The United States is a place that does not provide sufficient approximations. A patch was agreed in 2000 called the Safe Harbor Agreement, by which some American companies could voluntarily agree with a set of standards that the Europeans were willing to accept as equivalent. That status quo is now under threat. Beginning in 2012, the Europeans, for domestic reasons, began a process of reforming their data privacy protections. That process is due to be concluded in 2014, and that process is expected to increase the gap between what the Europeans do and American standards, undermining the Safe Harbor Agreement. But the Safe Harbor Agreement has also come under threat in the wake of Edward Snowden's revelations, and there's currently a review going on by the European Commission about whether Safe Harbor is adequate in the current circumstances. Now, this is a big issue. It's far beyond what I can talk about, but you're in luck. On the 14th of November, we're having an event with people who know much more about it than I do, talking about Safe Harbor, data privacy. The details are on the Nunn School website. Our speakers will be Adam Schlosser, who's the point person on data privacy for the US Chamber of Commerce, and Peter Swire, who joined Scheller in the summer, who was actually involved in negotiating the Safe Harbor Agreement for the Clinton administration and is currently on President Obama's review group on intelligence and communication technology. So, as I say, people who know a lot more about the subject than I do. So please come. There are a number of other issues that are sort of off the table. One is audiovisual services. The French government insisted on the exclusion of these on the grounds that it didn't want the EU cultural exception that allows supports for cultural industries and restrictions on how much foreign content can be shown to be challenged. And the United States is reluctant to talk about financial services because the Treasury feels that if they get into negotiations about that, that will slow down implementation of Frank Dodd. So where does this leave us? Well, the interpenetration between the two economies has reduced the traditional economic and political costs of the agreement. That makes things easier. Agriculture is still a sticky point, but now for reasons of regulation rather than for subsidies and market access, as it has been traditionally in the transatlantic relationship. Addressing the regulatory barriers to trade is going to be really difficult. Even when it's not politically fraught, it's administratively and legally challenging. The 2014 target is completely unrealistic. That's why I expect the agreement will be narrower rather than broader. I think they'll probably make quite a lot of progress on tariffs. I don't anticipate much, if any, approximation of existing rules. I think there will be some equivalence established, but not nearly as, and that will be in automobiles, but not as much as they would like, though there will be a rolling process where more equivalence will be established in future. I think there'll be probably quite a bit of progress on reducing compliance costs, right? But this will be about improving the process rather than changing what they're trying to achieve. I think government procurement, the federal government will probably do some expansion of exclusion from Buy American. With the states, it will depend on whether they can be persuaded that it's good for taxpayers. You have more competition, the taxpayer dollar goes further, rather than protecting jobs, which has been the focus thus far. I don't think that the Americans will give much on geographic indications, given that they won't be giving the agricultural interests what they want in terms of regulatory change in the EU. I can't see them doing any more to piss off agricultural lobbies in the United States. It's worth noting that this narrower agreement is not good news for third countries. Right? The gains for them come from regulatory cooperation between the United States and the European Union. If that doesn't happen, and particularly if you don't have agreement on common standards, which I think is very unlikely, the benefits to the rest of the world essentially disappear. What will be key politically to securing the agreement will be managing disappointment. And this question, you have had, will actors be so annoyed that they don't get all that they want that they'll throw their toys out of the pram and actually block the agreement? Or is more likely they'll simply not bother to support it, as Business Europe has threatened. Now, I think we have a little bit of time for questions before Mickey exam starts. I should say, if you are interested, I'll be teaching a course on transatlantic relations next semester, where we'll be talking about this in future. So, Maggie.
Thanks, Alistair. I'm curious, when you mentioned that it's right to maintain the precautionary principle, could you talk a little bit more about how that is being sort of, that conception of a right, which I think is a issue that in of itself could be disputed, but how that is being implemented and executed in terms of these international agreements?
Well, I mean, the thing is that it's actually established in WTO law now that the states have a right to set their appropriate level of protection. It's not, that cannot be challenged by under WTO law, and that's what they're saying. So they talk about it in terms of their right to make those choices, and so and once you have the choice to determine what level of protection is acceptable, then you can do quite a lot.
So how is it codified in WTO? Because WTO doesn't say precautionary principle, does it?
No, it doesn't. But it's part of it's part of the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement is the extent to which states have to use international standards or could adopt standards of their own, and as part of the judgment in the dispute over hormone-treated beef, it was underlined that Article 3.3 of the SPS agreement provides states significant scope to make choices about what level of protection they want, and the precautionary principle is part of that choice. Right? So the right is to set the appropriate level of protection. Precautionary principle is part of how you do that. Okay. Katja?
So some of the obstacles you mentioned, the EU at least had dealt with previously. So is the issue now that they need to be dealt with on a transatlantic basis? I was thinking like the Parma-Ham geographic indication. The Single European Act in the late 80s did away with stuff like the German beer purity law or the cassis de law. I mean, the European Court of Justice has decided that this is discriminatory practices. And why do we have to open that?
Well, the question is to open it with the United States. Right? They've resolved it internally, but the way they've resolved them internally is different from how the United States do it. So the question is, then do you try and do the same thing internationally? I think it was Karel de Gucht gave a very odd speech in Prague earlier this month, where he cited the Single European Market Program as resolving all of these issues, and then didn't relate that at all to what they're actually going to do in the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership negotiations. It's just not feasible in the context of the differences are too great and you don't have the institutional structures to push this process. Bob?
I've got an interactive question. That is, what's the interactive aspect of NAFTA, European trade, Pacific trade? How do these things interact? Because obviously they're going to have effects on each other, and as you're negotiating one, you have to be looking over your shoulder looking at the other one. If you've already negotiated NAFTA, how's that?
Well, I mean, NAFTA is now being replaced by the Trans-Pacific Partnership because both Canada and Mexico are part of that process. So they're going. So that's the idea, is that's going to go further. It's working out those connections is going to be challenging. What you have is you have situations where you have like U.S. business groups liking what they've managed to agree in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and saying, well, that's what we should get the same thing with the Europeans. We have the same, approach, but they're separate negotiations, so that's probably not going to happen. In the EU-Canada agreement, there was provisions built in, sort of assuming the completion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so things will become, that will actually feed through into the Canadian-EU agreement. To do with rules of origin, so what counts as a Canadian car will change as the Trans-Pacific Partnership comes in. But there are tensions between them, and obviously regulators would want the same, and trade officials would like the same agreements as much as possible because it makes their lives easier, but it's unlikely to happen because of power.
Alistair, both the European Union and the U.S. have lots and lots of political issues and problems and crises right now. Is this process sufficiently insulated from that doesn't affect that, the leadership and the multitasking? Or is there a drag on this process due to any of these other political crises?
Well, I mean, you have the internal crises, and then there's the transatlantic crisis to do with the scandal around data privacy, which is exacerbating that part of the story, and the Europeans are complaining about the lack of trust is something that's an impediment to the negotiations, and but I think the stakes are probably high enough that that's not going to derail the issue. But obviously the internal processes are something of a distraction. I mean, the government shutdown has directly impeded the negotiation of the agreement. To an extent, it's less of an issue. To an extent, at this stage, now that the negotiations have started, the trade negotiators aren't deeply, the direct actors directly involved in the negotiations aren't also directly involved in these other problems. Those tend to be higher political issues. If we start getting to sticking points and come to ratification, if there are still these big internal crises, that's when they'll start to see a drag on the negotiations. Joe?
Alistair, you pointed out the amount of trade that is really intra-firm
Yeah.
at this point. My question is, to what extent is this normalization going to be really conducted at the level 2 between firms of common interest? I mean, it took the consumer electronics industry about 2 years to figure out you could have a common 50-cycle, 60-cycle AC/DC just to change the plug. And a lot of what's being assembled in automobiles comes from all over the world. And so my question, it seems to me that at least it's more likely that what's going to happen is those are the elephants, the multinationals are the elephants that are actually going to work this out. And the level 1 official negotiator is going to be like going around with a broom and shovel behind him, sort of ratifying what has been de facto accomplished. Am I overstating this?
Well, you're dealing with two different sets of standards. I mean, like the electronics industry, those are private standards, and so the firms can just agree amongst themselves, and that's what they're going to do. The real issue is regulations that have the force of law, and there are different legal requirements in the United States and the European Union for car windows, right? And the opening mechanism. And these are things that are very, very tightly regulated. And what the companies are trying to do is say, look, we've come up with solutions. You basically want the same thing. We've got a fix that does the same thing that you want. You just got little differences in how exactly it should look, but they have the same effect. And that's what they're trying to do. And they're trying to present, so what the automobile industry is doing is sitting down and going case by case. These regulations are the same on both sides of the Atlantic. Won't you agree? And the European Commission seems to be okay with that. But
That's because the firms are leading this thing.
Well, yeah, well, they're,
Germany brought it back. We went through this.
yeah. Yeah, they say, look, we're sure these have the same effect, so just accept them as equivalent. And they may be able to get there in the end, but the National Highway Transport Safety Administration is saying, you may be right, but you need to prove it. We're not just going to assume you're right, which makes it a much slower process. And it is possible to do equivalence. The Federal Aviation Administration and the European Aviation Safety Authority concluded an equivalence agreement in 2011 where they accept each other's certifications of civil aviation, of aircraft parts and aircraft. So it's possible, but it's a distinct industry, and that still took them 7 years to conclude. So it's not easy. Anything else? We can.
To what extent do you think issues, particularly related to the agricultural sector, has the risk again of these issues becoming kind of sensationalized and very misleading in the media, and therefore we kind of get into this cycle, and I think it's to degenerate into this: Europeans are anti-science, the Americans pursue sound science, or these kinds of questions. I mean, that's something that's interesting to me, because particularly at this moment, I mean, we've been reassessing the state of the European Union, the future of the European Union, and the state of transatlantic relations for at least the last decade, and most people are pretty pessimistic. So I think all of this cheerleading and championing of this game-changing agreement, the enthusiasm is, I think, largely spearheaded by the business community. But in Europe this summer, some of the students in the room, I think, witnessed this. I mean, there's quite already some, galvanizing energy, particularly in the culture industries, but also labor and in the food sector, those who are opposed in Europe to big agribusiness. So to what extent is this going to be different? I mean, it seems like all the signs are there for it to degenerate again into this very ineffective conversation, which is often not really what's being negotiated, but it's these broad cultural stereotypes and misunderstandings between Americans and Europeans. Can you just comment on what you think the risks are of that at this time?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that the USTR Michael Froman has been downplaying the differences. I mean, he gave a speech recently where he said that depicting the United States as sound science and the EU as only doing the precautionary principle is anachronistic and overstates the differences. And so there's clearly, the administration seems to be downplaying those differences. And the thing is, as you said, this is being driven by transatlantic business groups, and they really do not want agriculture to derail the story, right? This is about them, and agriculture is a side. So there's quite a lot of counterweight from those kinds of groups about how to go, so it's really only the agricultural interests that are making play of those differences. I mean, there are regulatory differences elsewhere that, I mean, yes, the business groups American business groups would like to see, and even the Europeans would like to see a more sound science approach in European regulation, but they're not making a big song and dance about it. And there are things like there's another transatlantic alliance is actually in biotechnology, and they've got a very pragmatic response. They want the Europeans to speed up the process, but they're not asking for any changes to how decisions are made, and they've basically given up on trying to grow crops in Europe. Yeah, they have. Monsanto has pulled out and says bear.